How far would your own blood go when they think you are no longer looking? It is a question I never expected to ask myself at 74. You see, I always believed that a home was more than just wood and bricks. To me, it was the place where my late wife, Martha, planted the yellow roses by the front porch. It was the place where the kitchen floor still has that little scratch from when our son David dropped his first bicycle. I used to look at that scratch and smile. Now I look at it and wonder when the warmth left his heart. I was a carpenter by trade. My hands are rough and my knuckles are swollen from years of holding a hammer, but I know how things are built. I know that a good foundation takes time and you cannot rush a structure if you want it to stand. When I built our home back in the summer of 1982, I made sure every single beam was straight. But there was one little detail, something most people would think was completely worthless, that I spent an extra week on. Right under the floorboards of the master closet, I put in a small, hidden storage box. It was just a simple tin container tucked away between the joists, held down by 2 loose brass screws. At the time, I didn't put money or gold in it. I just put a small, leather-bound notebook inside. It was my private ledger where I kept track of every penny I spent building the house, along with the original handwritten receipts from the local lumber yard. To David, it was just an old piece of junk when he saw it once as a teenager. He laughed and told me I was wasting my time saving old papers. I didn't say much. I just smiled, tightened the screws, and covered it back up with the old wool rug. It stayed there, completely forgotten, for over 40 years. Then came the winter when my chest began to feel heavy. It started as a small cough on a Tuesday, and by Friday night I couldn't catch my breath. The ambulance lights were very bright against the snow as they loaded me in. I remember the cold air, and then for a long time I remember nothing at all. The doctors told David I was in critical condition in the intensive care unit. They weren't sure if my old heart would keep beating. For 2 weeks, I was hooked up to machines, drifting in and out of dark dreams. I could hear voices sometimes, but they sounded like they were underwater. When I finally opened my eyes, the room was very quiet. My fever was gone, but I felt as weak as a newborn kitten. David was sitting in the vinyl chair by the window, clicking away on his shiny smartphone. He didn't look up right away. When he did, there was no relief in his eyes. There was only a strange, hurried sort of nervousness. He stood up, patted my hand, his palm felt dry and cold, and told me I needed to rest. He said he had taken care of everything back at the house so I wouldn't have to worry. I thought he meant he had watered Martha's plants or emptied the refrigerator. I thanked him, closed my eyes, and went back to sleep, grateful for my son. 3 days later, the hospital staff said I was well enough to sit in a wheelchair. I wanted some fresh air, so I asked the nurse if I could go near the lobby windows. As we passed the main desk, I saw a local real estate magazine sitting on the coffee table. It was one of those free booklets they give out at the grocery store. I don't know why, but my eyes caught a photograph on the front cover. It was a beautiful, familiar front porch with yellow roses, now covered in a light dusting of frost. Underneath the picture, in bold, black letters, it read, "Beautiful mid-century property, estate sale, motivated seller, immediate possession available." My breath caught in my throat, my hand shook so badly I could barely pick up the pages. It was my house, my address. David had put it on the market the very day after I was admitted to the ICU while I was still fighting for my life on a ventilator. When David came to visit that evening, I held the magazine out to him. I didn't scream. I didn't have the strength to scream. I just looked at him and asked him why. He didn't even blink. He sat down, folded his arms, and spoke to me in a voice that was altogether too soft, the kind of voice you use with a child who doesn't understand the rules. He told me it was time to be realistic. He said the house was too big for an old man, that the maintenance was costing too much money, and that he had already accepted a cash offer from a developer. The developer wanted to tear it down and build 3 small townhouses on the lot. David looked me in the eye and said the paperwork was already moving through the county office. He had used the old power of attorney form I signed years ago when I had my hip surgery. He told me he was doing this for my own good, to pay for a nice, quiet room in an assisted living facility town over. When I told him I wanted to go home, he just sighed, shook his head, and said, "Dad, the papers are signed. There is nothing you can do. It is already over." They discharged me from the hospital a few days later, but I didn't go to an assisted living home. An old neighbor of mine, Clara, picked me up. She had known Martha and me for 30 years, and she knew what that house meant to us. Clara didn't say much on the drive, but she let me stay in her spare bedroom. She made me hot tea, and she listened to me pour my heart out. I felt small. I felt like an old coat that had been folded up and tossed into a dark closet because it was no longer useful. My own son had looked at my life's work and seen nothing but a paycheck. The next morning, Clara brought a friend over. His name was Thomas, a retired clerk who used to work down at the county record's office. Thomas was a quiet man with thick glasses and a kind smile. He sat at Clara's kitchen table, spread out a few maps, and began to ask me questions. Not about David and not about the hospital, but about the land itself. He asked me exactly when I bought the property, who I bought it from, and how the boundaries were drawn. I told him everything I could remember, but my mind was foggy from the illness. I told him about the old tin box under the closet floorboards. Thomas paused, his pen hovering over his legal pad. He asked me if those original receipts and the old ledger were still there. I told him they should be, unless David had cleared out the master bedroom already. Thomas looked at me, his eyes serious behind his thick lenses. He said we needed to get into that house just once before the sale closed at the end of the week. It was a rainy Thursday when Clara drove us over. David's car wasn't in the driveway. There was a large red sold sign stuck into the wet grass right next to Martha's rose bushes. Walking up those front steps felt like visiting a graveyard. The house inside was cold and echoed with emptiness. David had already packed up most of my clothes into cardboard boxes stacked in the hallway. My heart sank. But when I walked into the master closet and pushed aside the heavy winter coats, I saw the old wool rug was still there. My knees hurt terribly as I knelt down on the hard floor. My hands were shaking, but I found the 2 loose brass screws. I turned them slowly with a pocket knife I had in my trousers. The wood gave way with a soft creak. There it was, the old tin box covered in a thin layer of 40-year-old dust. I opened the lid, and inside lay the leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with time, alongside the crisp, faded receipts from 1982. Thomas took the notebook and began to read through my neat, handwritten columns. Suddenly, he stopped. He pointed his finger at a receipt from the county surveyor dated 3 months after the house was finished. There was a small map drawn in faded blue ink on the back of the page, showing a 3-foot strip of land along the western boundary of the property. Thomas looked up at me, and for the first time in weeks, someone was smiling. He told me that David and his wealthy developer had made a massive mistake. When the developer surveyed the land for their townhouses, they relied on the public county maps, which had been copied incorrectly during a digital system update back in the 90s. But my original physical deed in the surveyor's receipt showed something very different. That 3-foot strip of land didn't belong to the main lot. It was a separate parcel that I had purchased directly from the railroad company back then, and it was never legally attached to the house deed. And as it turned out, that tiny 3-foot strip ran directly through the center of where the developer planned to lay the main sewer and water lines for all 3 new buildings. Without it, the townhouses could not legally be built, and the entire multi-million-dollar project would be completely dead in the water. David had the power to sell the house, yes, but he didn't own that tiny strip of dirt. I did. The power of attorney he held only applied to my primary estate assets, but this separate parcel was listed under an old family trust name that required my physical living signature to transfer. The next afternoon, we held a meeting at the lawyer's office. David was there, sitting next to a man in an expensive suit who represented the development company. They both looked bored, like they were just waiting to get an old man to sign the final disclosure forms. David wouldn't even look me in the eye, he kept staring at his watch. The lawyer cleared his throat and laid my old leather notebook on the mahogany table, right next to the modern printed contracts. He explained the situation calmly, pointing to the blue ink map from 1982. The developer's face turned from pale to bright red in a matter of seconds. He stood up, looked at the papers, and muttered a very foul word under his breath. He turned to David and told him the deal was off unless this was fixed immediately. David looked at me then, truly looked at me. The arrogance was completely gone from his face. He started to stammer, telling me that we could work this out, that he would make sure I got a bigger room, that he was doing all of this for my future. I stood up from my chair. I didn't feel weak anymore. I looked at my son and I felt a deep, quiet sadness for the man he had become. I told the developer that the 3-foot strip of land was not for sale, not for any price. The contract was voided that very hour. The townhouses could not be built. The house with the yellow roses still belongs to me, and it will remain exactly as it is for as long as I am drawing breath. David left the office without saying another word. We haven't spoken since that day, and my phone has been very quiet. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun go down over the yard, and I feel a great peace. But when the wind blows through the trees, the house can feel very large and very empty. It makes me wonder about the things we leave behind. If you had to choose between a comfortable, quiet life with no worries or a difficult truth that saves your dignity but costs you the only family you have left, which one would you choose?